Okay. So welcome everyone to another installment of the California Fire Science Seminar Series hosted by the Fire Research Group at University of California, Berkeley, and in partnership with the California Fire Science Consortium. I am Dr. Crystal Colden. I'm at the University of California, Merced, and my co-hosts in this endeavor are Dr. Michael Gallner, who is at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Jeanette Kobiani-Nicois, who is with me at University of California, Merced. And we are very excited to host our speaker this week, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. But first, I would like to remind you or let you know for the first time, if you haven't joined us before, that you are muted at both audio and visual. If you have questions, please enter your questions into the Q&A, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. There's a bar that has a little Q&A box, and you're able to open that up and input questions in there at any time throughout the talk. We'll have a little bit of time at the end of the talk to answer some of those questions. And then if you would like to join us for the second hour of this discussion, then we will actually have a separate Zoom that is more the traditional discussion style Zoom, where you'll be able to interact with the speaker, ask additional questions, and just generally join the discussion. And that is actually at a different location because it's not the webinar format. So we will put the link into the chat box as we get towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so for today, our speaker today is Dr. Erin Hanan from the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm absolutely delighted to have Erin on as a friend and colleague for many years now. Erin is an assistant professor at University of Nevada, Reno in natural resources and environmental sciences. She runs the Fire and Dryland Ecosystems Lab, looking at how climate change and management activities influence fire regimes and how changing fire regimes affect ecosystem and watershed processes. She uses both empirical analysis and modeling to understand wildfire drivers and effects at scales ranging from individual soil cores all the way up to ecoregions. She has a PhD in California at University of California, Santa Barbara, in ecology, evolution, and marine biology. And she was previously a postdoc at Washington State University. So we're very excited to have her talking about her work today. And with that, I will let you take it away, Erin.
Great, thank you, Crystal. And thank you everybody for coming. So we know that large and destructive wildfires are increasing globally. And so each year there are new records set in terms of area burned, firefighting and mitigation costs, structures destroyed, or lives that are claimed. And so it's growing more and more urgent to understand what's causing these extreme events and what their effects will be on the ecosystems and watersheds that we depend on. And so before I get into my talk, I just want to start by thanking funders and the many people who have helped make my research possible. And I especially want to thank my students and postdoc who are helping me start some really exciting projects in dryland watersheds. So as Crystal mentioned, my research focuses on how wildfires influence plant, soil, and hydrologic processes, and then how these processes are interacting across scales in watersheds. So a really important question is, how are these interactions affected by climate change and human activities? And to answer that, we really need to have models that are able to bridge spatial scales and extend temporal scales. So models are really useful because they take our assumptions about a system and they synthesize them to generate projections. But to be credible and to really advance science, models need to be continually confronted with observations and field data. So that includes data for parameterization, evaluating uncertainty, and improving the way we represent different mechanisms. So my research explores both fine-scale mechanisms in the field and lab, as well as large-scale patterns. And then I use that information to improve and inform process-based models. And then finally, I'm using models to project over space and time in order to understand biogeochemical and ecohydrologic processes in fire-prone systems. So today, my talk today is going to mainly focus on modeling work, but I will say that my background is in biogeochemistry, and because I had many questions that sort of scaled up to watersheds, I began using ecohydrologic models as a way of sort of bridging among all of these interacting processes. So these are just some of the systems that I work in. And so they include a California chaparral, where I did a lot of my PhD research, forested watersheds in the Idaho batholith and Central Rockies, and forest and shrubland systems in the Sierra Nevada and Great Basin. So as we all know, globally, many ecosystems are fire dominated, and that's illustrated in this figure where the intensity of red is related to fire activity. And so given that, it's really important to understand how fire affects ecosystems and watersheds. So we also know that the frequency of large and severe fires is increasing globally. And that's illustrated for the Western US in this figure that was developed by Phil Dennison. In the center, it's a map of fires that occurred between 1984 and 2011. And then the surrounding histograms are showing the number of fires occurring in each year have increased in, or how they've increased in many ecoregions. Not all, but in many regions. And since 2014, when the paper was written, we've experienced, as many of us know, many more record-setting fires across the West. So this leads to two key questions that motivate my research. So one, how do climate change and human actions influence fire regimes? And then two, how do changing fire regimes affect ecosystem and watershed processes? And so I'm going to start with the first question, which is how do climate change and human actions influence fire regimes? And I've included photos of my very wise co-authors who have contributed in a lot of really, really important ways to this research. So we know that the frequency of large, severe wildfires has increased in the Western US or Western North America, and actually globally. And so two major factors that are driving these increases are one, fuel accumulation due to historical fire suppression, and two, climate change. So starting with fuels, in some regions, extensive fire suppression that began in the early 1900s has led to a buildup of dead materials or surface fuels and an increase in understory density, and that creates ladder fuels. And so collectively, these factors have increased forest flammability and the spread of fire from surface layers into the upper canopy. And this is particularly true in seasonally dry forests like those in the southwestern US and in many parts of the Sierras. And so just as an example, in the southwestern US, so dry forest historically burned at high frequency and low severity. But changes in forest structure have altered the natural fire regime. And this is illustrated in this very well-known paper by Craig Allen, where the top image I'm showing is representative of sort of the pre-1900s condition for a ponderosa pine forest. And so you can see there's this grassy understory and surface fire activity. And then the bottom is showing an altered ponderosa pine stand where there are dense ladder fuels that have developed. And so this can promote unnaturally severe crown fires. And so for an example in California, this is an image from the 2013 Rim Fire, which burned about 400 square kilometers in and around Yosemite. And this is a region that should have a relatively frequent low severity fire regime, but historical fire exclusion contributed, in addition to other factors, to making the Rim Fire an abnormally severe event. And so that said, the role of suppression is not always very straightforward. And that's especially true in areas that typically experience mixed severity fire regimes. And so a potential confounding problem is that over the period that fires have become larger and more severe, the climate has also been changing. So climate change is increasing spring and summer temperatures, and that's leading to earlier snowmelt and a declining snowpack. And these factors can promote a longer fire season and also drier fuels, leading to increased fire danger and larger and more severe fires. So over the last decade or a little bit longer than that, we've made really major progress in understanding climate fire relationships at large scales. So for example, across the Western US or across Western North America. And so in this example, John Abatzoglu and Park Williams plotted forest fire area against fuel aridity. And they showed that, not surprisingly, burned area is increasing with fuel aridity. And so also fuel aridity has been higher in recent years, and that's illustrated with the red dots. So they're showing 2000 to 2015. And these increases are directly correlated with larger fires. So I guess even though the relationship between climate change and fire activity is becoming clearer at these very large scales, we still don't have a very clear picture of how climate change and fire suppression are interacting at regional and watershed scales. And we really need to understand these smaller scale relationships because it's really key for developing effective management strategies. Management is happening at landscape scales. So one thing we do know is that the extent that fire suppression versus climate change are influencing fire activity in a given location depends on that location's historical fire regime. And so what I mean by fire regime is the range of variability of fire characteristics over a defined space and time. And so that includes things like frequency, the type of fire, is it a ground fire versus a canopy fire, fire size, severity, season. And so I will point out that fire regimes are continually changing. And so this is not a perfect term, but it's a convenient term for understanding typical patterns over some defined period of time. So fire regimes range from being limited by climate or the flammability of fuel to being limited by fuel availability. And so in a climate limited system, such as like the Western Cascades, there's typically enough fuel for fire to spread, but moisture is too high. And so these systems are characterized by large, infrequent fires that historically only occurred during very extreme climate circumstances. But climate warming is increasing fuel aridity and the occurrence of severe fire, and that's particularly true in locations where fuels are abundant. In fuel limited systems, on the other hand, the climate is arid, and so it's conducive to fire, but fire might be limited by the amount of fuel that's present or available to burn. And so these systems typically experience frequent low severity fires. But in a lot of these fuel limited regions, such as Southwestern Ponderosa pine forest, which I illustrated before, extensive fire suppression has changed fuel structure and loading and led to larger and more destructive fires. And so these are the systems that may benefit the most from fuel management from an ecological perspective. So that said, things are never this simple. So a complicating factor to understand what drives fire activity at local scales is that a lot of forested systems in the West exist somewhere in the middle of this gradient. And so these are what are called the mixed severity fire regimes, and fire activity is driven by some combination of fuel loading and fuel aridity. So thinking about fire risk, it tends to be highest somewhere in the middle of the aridity gradient. So this is where fire isn't extremely flammability or extremely fuel limited. And this is sort of where many ecosystems and watersheds in the Sierra Nevada or inland Northwest are falling. And so it's not always clear which drivers dominate in these like specific locations. And that's especially true at the scales where management occurs. So there's a clear need to understand fire regime drivers at management relevant scales, because that's going to inform when and where management will be most effective. But disentangling the effects of climate change and fire suppression is really, really challenging at these scales, because the signal to noise ratio can be really low. And so that's due to a variety of things, including interannual variability in meteorological drivers and responses to those drivers, and also confounding factors, things like lightning, large scale wind patterns, and forest health and other disturbances. So for example, whether or not a forest has been affected by bark beetles. So I'm hoping to be making the case for simulation modeling, which is really a critical tool for addressing some of this complexity and for bridging scales. So models really, they enable us to isolate the effects of fuels and climate by holding everything else constant, which is just not possible in field studies. And so fire regime models, this is relatively new. They might be especially useful because they can account for these long-term interactions between climate or among climate management and fire activity. And so I am working with many collaborators with a novel modeling framework that simulates fire regimes as an emergent property of both top-down climate and bottom-up environmental drivers. And so some of those bottom-up drivers include things like hydrology, biogeochemistry, vegetation dynamics. And that's illustrated in this sort of the right orangish yellow portion of the figure. And so again, because fires are an emergent property of the system, the framework is really robust to non-stationarity and climate conditions, and to positive and negative feedbacks that drive fire activity over time. So things like fuel self-limitation. The modeling framework also includes methods for using remote sensing products to initialize fire histories or to constrain vegetation processes. But for the rest of my talk today, I'm really focusing on this right side of the framework. So using the coupled fire regime model. And so in this model, there's an ecohydrologic model called RESIS that simulates fuel structure and loading over time. And that feeds into a stochastic fire spread model called WM-Fire. Following fire spread, fire effects feed back into RESIS by updating stand structure. And that in turn influences carbon cycling, ecohydrologic processes, including things like how fuels recover, and future fire behavior. And so it's this coupling that allows us to simulate long-term fire regimes, again, as an emergent property of the system, not based on past fires. And so I'm going to quickly give a little bit of background on each component of the model and how it works, starting with RESIS. So RESIS is a process-based land surface model that aggregates data from several different spatial data layers, and it represents the distribution of topographic, vegetation, soil, and hydrologic characteristics in a watershed. And so the four things in the model are climate drivers. And so we take climate inputs and feed them into these process-based submodels that calculate carbon, nitrogen, and water fluxes over this complex terrain. And so RESIS simulates several ecohydrologic and biogeochemical processes. Just to name a few, streamflow, net primary productivity, and nitrogen cycling. And so one of the strengths of this model is that it is tightly coupling both hydrologic and biogeochemical processes over space and time. And that's what makes it really ideal for representing carbon, nitrogen, and water in either mountainous watersheds or in watersheds where these fluxes and plant growth are water limited. such as the Western US or Western North America. So as I mentioned, RESIS is simulating fuel development over space and time in a watershed. And that in turn is feeding into a stochastic model for fire spread called WM-Fire that was developed by Maureen Kennedy, who is at University of Washington, Tacoma. I'll talk just briefly about that. So fire spread model, there's a lot of fire spread models out there and they range in their complexity. So simple empirical models can be used to classify large scale fire regimes, whereas fully physical models are really, really powerful for predicting fire behavior. And so these are single event fire models that require a lot of detail. And if they're properly parameterized, again, they can be really, really powerful for predicting the path of individual fires. And so the issue, so I guess like, as we look into the future, in addition to having these very tactical models, we need tools for better strategic long-term planning. And so that means being able to evaluate how climate and management influence long-term fire regimes. So WM-Fire is set up to match the complexity of RESIS, which is intermediate in complexity. And so this framework does not enable us to model the paths of specific fires. So this is not a tactical fire model, but it's demonstrated a lot of skill in replicating fire regime characteristics and fire effects for multiple different types of fire regimes and land cover types. And so the strength of this model is that because fire regimes are an emergent property of the system, it's really well suited for evaluating how climate change and how human actions are interacting over space and over time to influence fire regimes. So very quickly, how it works. It's a stochastic model and it provides probability distributions of fire activity over time. And so fire spread is simulated over randomized ignition and stochastic spread. Potential ignitions occur at the end of each month. And ignition rates can be calibrated based on watershed size. A current limitation though is that it mainly assumes fires are not ignition limited. There are some plans to improve this in the future, but it's really looking at how vegetation, fuels, and climate are influencing fire. And so fire start is based on fuel load and fuel moisture. And if you have a successful fire start, the model produces maps of fire spread, and those are based on fuel load, moisture, wind, and slope. So maps of fire spread then feed into a model for fire effects that was developed by Ryan Bart at UC Merced. And this basically updates post-fire stand structure and fuel loading in RESIS. And so very quickly, the way that works, the fire effects model is accounting for fire intensity and for vegetation structure, which can influence whether or not fire is spreading into a canopy. And so fire initially consumes litter and coarse woody debris based on the consume model. And then fire intensity is calculated as a function of the same exact factors that are driving fire spread. And then mortality in the understory is a function of fire intensity. And so the default is a one-to-one relationship between those two things. But this relationship can be adjusted and calibrated when there are data available. And also mortality following a fire is divided into biomass consumed where carbon is lost versus residual biomass where there's dead plant material that ultimately returns to litter pools. So then overstory mortality is based on how much litter and understory vegetation is consumed. So that means overstory mortality it's simulating passive crown fire. And that has two parameters that can be adjusted. One is for the height threshold that fire spreads into the canopy. So that's based on an understory height versus an overstory height. And that's here. And the other parameter is the shape of that relationship. So Now that I've given a brief summary of how the model works, the specific question that we asked is, what are the roles of climate change and fire suppression in driving fire activity in the inland Northwest? And so we developed a modeling experiment in 2 watersheds in Idaho. And this is an area that experienced some of the most intense early fire suppression efforts in response to the Great 1910 fires. And so Johnson Creek on the left is in the Idaho batholith ecoregion, which is sort of north central Idaho. This is a mixed pine dominated watershed with mostly ponderosa pine at low elevations and then lodgepole pine at higher elevations. And so the elevations range from approximately 1,400 to 3,000 meters. And the watershed historically burned under a mixed severity regime, where lower elevations tended to burn more frequently and higher elevations experienced only stand replacing fires. And then Trail Creek on the right is a subcatchment of the Bigwood River Basin in the Sawtooth National Forest. This is near Ketchum or Sun Valley, Idaho. So the watershed is in the middle Rockies ecoregion, and elevations are a little more pronounced here. So they range from about 1,700 to about 3,500 meters. And then there's a very strong elevation gradient in the watershed. So lower to middle elevations are covered by a mixture of sagebrush, some dry ponderosa pine forests and grasslands, while mid to high elevations are dominated by Doug fir, lodgepole pine, and some mixed pine species. And so this is a watershed that has also experienced a mixed severity fire regime with, again, a very strong elevation gradient. And so also in general, I will point out that Johnson Creek is sort of the more mesic watershed, and Trail Creek is a fairly arid watershed, especially in the southern portion. So our approach was to run a modeling experiment with and without climate change and with and without fire suppression in a factorial design. Fire suppression we modeled as complete fire exclusion. And so this generated 4 scenarios with 200 iterations of the coupled fire regime model for each scenario. So we have a counterfactual scenario where there's no fire exclusion, no anthropogenic climate change, a sort of historical scenario where both are included, and versions where there's only climate change or only exclusion. And this is to tease apart what the role of these drivers are. So for climate inputs, we used GridMet, which is a gridded climate data set produced by John Abatsoglu at UC Merced. He's a collaborator on the project. And this is just an example, but what I'm showing here is mean annual daily maximum temperature data with and without historical anthropogenic climate change. And so the full set of meteorological inputs are listed here on the right. And for this project, John generated a 116-year record that is bias corrected, and he used an ensemble of 23 GCMs to determine how much climate inputs were affected by anthropogenic climate change for each month in our time series. And then finally, he used those values to create a time series of daily weather that subtracts the influence of modeled anthropogenic climate change by subtracting the monthly signal from daily observation. So it maintains that daily variability. So for scenarios with complete fire exclusion, we ran with a fire model turned off for the period between 1910 and 1979. So that's this fire exclusion period. And then finally, we had this assessment period where we ran each scenario with a fire model turned on. And that is what enabled us to ask how climate change and prior fire exclusion are interacting to influence fire activity over an approximate 3-decade period. And so I'm going to walk through a few of the results that we found. So I am starting with some just mean fire regime characteristics. And what I'm starting with is just looking at the full basin scale. So averaged over the full basin for the 1980 to 2017 assessment period. And so here I'm showing the distribution of 4 fire regime characteristics for each model scenario. So climate change scenarios are orange and brown, and I'm going to use this color scheme throughout. Climate change, orange and brown. Suppression scenarios are the dark colors. So no climate change are the blues. Climate change. Suppression is darker, and my logic, in case this helps, my logic is that darker means more fuel or more vegetation. So dark blue and brown are the suppression scenarios. And so the red line, just to make it really easy to look at, is the median value for the counterfactual scenario, which means the scenario, the light blue scenario where there is no climate change and no fire exclusion. And so here I'm showing mean fire size, 95th percentile fire size, so essentially largest fires, number of fire starts, and number of large fires. And so what you can see from this is that scenarios that include anthropogenic climate change and no prior exclusion, so orange, resulted in highest mean fire size, the largest 95th percentile fire size, and more fire starts and more large fires. By the way, this is Johnson Creek. This is the wetter of the 2 watersheds. So climate change, no exclusion, bumped everything up. Whereas scenarios with no climate change and with prior exclusion, so dark blue, resulted in the lowest overall values. And so for a given exclusion scenario, again, the dark colors, climate change, brown, resulted in both larger and more frequent fires. And for a given climate change scenario, so orange and brown, exclusion, which is brown, resulted in smaller and less frequent fires. And so what I gather from this is that Johnson Creek is a climate limited watershed because climate change is the strongest driver of fire activity. A kind of interesting thing though is that exclusion actually decreased fire in the watershed. That was not expected. And this occurred in large part because exclusion basically increased overstory canopy density, which provided shading and reduced evapotranspiration in subcanopy layers. So it created these microclimates that actually reduced fire in this watershed. But Trail Creek had a somewhat opposite response. So climate change, again, orange and brown, reduced the fire size and the number of fires, while exclusion, so dark colors, didn't have a large effect when looking at the full watershed scale. We're going to get into the sub-watershed scale, but at the full watershed scale, it wasn't a huge effect. So, so far I've been talking about fire size, frequency, fire severity, but a really important fire regime characteristic, is fire severity. So severity is something that seems to be increasing across the Western US. So here I'm showing cumulative fire severity in terms of basically just grams carbon removed from each fuel layer over time. And so I have the fine surface fuels, I have understory, and I have overstory. And I'm using the same color scheme as before, and starting with Johnson Creek, which is again the wetter watershed. And so results are similar to the other fire regime characteristics where climate change is increasing fire severity. And that was especially true in terms of overstory mortality. And so climate change scenarios are leading to more canopy fire in Johnson Creek. On the other hand, the exclusion scenario, so no climate change, but with exclusion, reduced fire severity and reduced the occurrence of crown fire, again, because of this microclimate that it was creating. So in Trail Creek, the differences were less pronounced among scenarios, but climate change generally decreased fire severity, and this happened by limiting fuel loads, whereas exclusion without climate change, so the dark blue, led to the highest fire severity. So in general, Trail Creek is a fuel limited system. Okay, so now that we've looked at the watershed scale patterns, what's happening at subwatershed scales? So I mentioned earlier that there can be strong elevational and aspect gradients, not to mention differences among different vegetation types in the watershed. And so I'm just going to start off by showing these maps. And so here I'm showing changes in burn probability in Johnson Creek for each scenario. So climate change scenarios are here on the left and exclusion scenarios are on the right. And so orange colors mean that there was an increase in burn probability, while blue colors means there was a decrease. And so to produce these maps, we basically calculated burn probability for each pixel in the watershed for a given year, averaged over all simulations, and then we took the difference between the counterfactual and actual scenario for a given driver. And so in Johnson Creek, in most locations, climate change increased the probability of fire. So in these two figures, while exclusion decreased the probability of fire in most locations. Again, a very climate limited system. In Trail Creek, on the other hand, climate change decreased the probability of fire in many locations, but especially in this southern portion of the watershed, which was much more arid. This was the much more arid portion of the basin where you had this mixture of different patches of sagebrush, maybe some dry forest and grass. And so overall, you can see, actually, let me also point out that exclusion, so these two figures in this region, slightly increased the probability of fire, so yellow as opposed to blue. And so the effect size and direction varies with location in a watershed. Fire regimes are behaving differently at very fine scales in the watershed. But why? So it's not enough to simply identify that the relative, climate versus fuel limited conditions can vary at fine scales. And so alone, as my co-author John pointed out, these maps are abstract art. And so instead, we really need to be able to discern these simple first order metrics that can indicate when and where fire regimes are going to shift from climate to fuel limited. So let me walk you through this figure. So here I'm showing burn probability on the Y as a function of temporally averaged soil moisture on the X. And so in this case, time averaged soil moisture is a proxy for how arid individual locations are within each watershed. And so by the way, a site is a 30-meter resolution pixel. And so the dashed lines represent the different scenarios in Trail Creek, and the solid lines are representing the different scenarios in Johnson Creek. And so overall, burn probability decreased with increasing average soil moisture. So just kind of looking at the whole thing, soil moisture increases, burn probability decreases. That's not surprising. And we also found that climate change scenarios, again, orange and brown, increased burn probability in Johnson Creek. And this occurred because even though climate change decreased fuel loading by reducing productivity, it simultaneously increased fuel aridity. And Johnson Creek is a climate rather than a fuel limited system. And also, I just want to point out that the climate change effects were most pronounced when soil moisture was above 35%. So as you might expect, Trail Creek had the opposite response. It's a more arid watershed where climate change actually decreased burn probability by decreasing fuel loading. And this response was most pronounced when average soil moisture was below 25%. So these are the most arid locations in the watershed. And so at the very extreme end of the gradient, climate change can decrease the probability of fire by decreasing fuel loading. But at these sort of intermediate levels of aridity, somewhere between 25 and 35% average soil moisture, we still need more information. And so sort of the take-home message here is that the drivers of fire regime are really location dependent within a watershed. In Johnson Creek, the more mesic watershed, climate change appears to be the strongest driver of fire activity. And this suggests that even if we allow fires to spread naturally or attempt to restore natural forest structure through controlled burns or thinning or fuel management, we're still going to see larger, more severe fires due to climate change. In Trail Creek, anthropogenic climate change is only increasing fire activity in the more mesic parts of the basin. And so in the driest locations, we found that climate change actually decreased fire by reducing fuel loads. And so keep in mind, these are already very arid locations that contain a mixture of pine and shrub species. And one big sort of caveat is that our rhesus modeling framework does not account for plant functional type conversions. And so we're seeing a decrease in productivity that is decreasing fire in the absolute most arid locations. But if a change in plant functional type occurs, that can affect fire in complex ways that we are not currently accounting for. So another sort of thing to point out in Trail Creek is that for fire exclusion to increase fire activity, there needs to be enough moisture to promote fuel accumulation. And this occurred in the moderately arid locations, so the northern part of the watershed, but not in the most arid locations. So now I just want to move away from the drivers of fire behavior to another key question that a lot of my research focuses on, which is how do changing fire regimes affect ecosystem and watershed function? So a key ecosystem function is nitrogen cycling. And so although nitrogen is a critical nutrient for recovering plants, too much nitrogen can act as a pollutant in streams and reservoirs. So this photo that I'm showing is the 2017 Whittier fire, which burned through the Santa Barbara backcountry above Lake Cachuma, which is the county's main reservoir. So this created a lot of concern among residents and resource managers that runoff from the burn slopes could completely devastate the local water supply. And these are concerns that grow with climate change since fire and precipitation are becoming increasingly variable and punctuated by these much more extreme events. And so some questions that I'm interested in are what mechanisms control nitrogen cycling and retention as ecosystems are recovering from fire? And how does climate affect the magnitude of post-fire nitrogen export? So during fire, large quantities of nitrogen are released from vegetation, from litter, from surface soils, and a lot of this nitrogen is oxidized and transported downslope. So that can be carried from pretty far inland to way offshore, which that's really well illustrated in this image from NASA, which was taken in 2003, which was a really massive fire year across California. So in addition to smoke and wind, water is a really powerful vehicle for post-fire export. And this is a picture that was taken after the debris flow that destroyed Montecito and San Ysidro Creeks after the 2017-2018 Thomas fire. And so a lot of the residents in Santa Barbara or in Montecito thought that the danger was over after the fire had passed. But 3 weeks later, there was this single rainstorm that lasted about 20 minutes and just like completely devastated the downslope community. That was an extreme event. Even in the absence of these massive debris flows, erosion and nutrient leaching can pose a threat to water quality in aquatic systems. And so elevated seasonal nitrogen export can occur for years after fire. And this is just a conceptual figure that illustrates pulses of nutrient export that can occur basically at the start of each winter rainy season that follow a fire in chaparral. And so the length of time and the volume of nitrogen being exported is going to depend on how fire changes watershed function and then how quickly ecosystems are recovering. So to evaluate how climate conditions both before and after fire influence nitrogen export in chaparral, I set up a modeling experiment with Rhesus where I replaced the precipitation data for 4 years before and 4 years after fire using basically just the driest and wettest years on record. And so in this graph, what I'm showing is nitrate export 2 years before and 2 years after fire. So I'm just starting by showing the simulations where fire is followed by wet conditions. So in both cases, most nitrogen export occurred during the first wet season after fire, and the pulse was slightly larger when the fire was preceded by wet conditions. So the red and the purple lines show what happens when fire was followed by drought. And so for one thing, the pulse of nitrogen during the first post-fire year was delayed here due to a later onset of the winter rainy season. And you can also see in both cases, there was this second pulse of nitrogen to the stream during the second year of recovery, which led to more total nitrogen export when fire was followed by drought. And so this occurred because drought suppressed plant recovery and nitrogen assimilation relative to the rates of mineralization and nitrification. So plants are more sensitive to drought than soil microbes. And so overall, in a chaparral ecosystem, nitrogen export is highest when fire is followed by drought. And that's kind of surprising, or it's a little counterintuitive because globally export increases with increasing precipitation. But at these ecosystem scales, because microbes are less sensitive than plants are to drought, if you have drought after fire, that allows mineral nitrogen to accumulate over these hot, dry summers and then just be flushed when wet up occurs, even with less precipitation. So these findings might suggest that climate can really powerfully influence nitrogen export by regulating how quickly plants are able to recover and begin to immobilize that nitrogen. So I am running out of time. And so I just want to wrap up by saying that models are a really powerful tool for synthesizing our assumptions about a system and using them to generate projections. So that said, models are elaborate hypotheses, and there's still a lot we don't know. And so I'm just going to outline a few of the key uncertainties that I think are really important moving forward, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. So for one, what is the future of fuels? So fuel loading is influenced by plant productivity and turnover. So how is productivity going to respond to climate change, increasing CO2 concentrations? And how will plant community composition and structure change in the future? And then finally, fuel loading is influenced by how quickly litter inputs decompose. And so this is a huge uncertainty in biogeochemical models. There's There's a lot of evidence that different models can show similar decomposition rates under current climate conditions, but be vastly divergent in the future. And so this is something we need to improve. Two, how will top-down climate drivers vary spatially in the future? So we know that climate is going to warm, but we're less clear about how precipitation is going to change. And so also, how are these precipitation patterns going to scale with elevation? Most of our weather stations occur at low elevations, and there can be a lot of uncertainty in our estimated lapse rates. And then finally, what is happening in the subsurface? How much water can soil store? If they can store a lot of water, they might buffer against interannual climate variability and drought, which can in turn influence fuel loading and moisture. And then in terms of fire feedbacks, how does soil heating vary, and how does that influence below ground processes? And so very, very quick shout out to my lab members who are helping me to chip away at some of these things. We're asking things like, how can we account for hot spots and hot moments when modeling watershed nitrogen dynamics? How does heating through a soil profile affect soil microbial and biogeochemical processes? How do biogeochemical and vegetation responses to fire vary along aridity gradients? How can we better represent fine fuel succession in models? And then finally, when and where will fuel treatments be most beneficial for mitigating fire risk and maintaining stable forest carbon? So final slide, I just want to end by saying that many of us are continuing to work towards improving models for wildfire projections, but there's still a lot we don't know, and there's still a lot that needs to be done to narrow some of these uncertainties. And so I think by continuing to develop different types of models and by confronting our models with observations and experiments, we can make major progress in informing future policy and management. And with that, I will be happy to take questions if there's time.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. And for those of you who missed the beginning, the way that we ask questions in this webinar format is please enter your question in the Q&A, which is a button on the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can add your question in there. In a few minutes here, we'll move over to the post-webinar discussion where you're actually able to see each other on screen and have maybe a little bit less formal format to interact. I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Erin, the first question asked by Will is, if high frequency and low severity is the objective, how do we quantify the benefits of small natural ignitions and prescribed burns as leading to lower carbon dioxide emissions overall? Are we able to quantify something like an environmental payback period so that we understand how short-term pain, i.e. small wildfires, leads to a long-term gain, i.e. fewer catastrophic wildfires and lower greenhouse gases? That's a long question.
That's a great, yeah. Okay, I'm going to try to answer all the pieces of that. That's a great question. And some of it, I think it depends on like the time scale that you're looking at. So if you are interested in, you know, if a forest is at steady state, then you're going to have a net carbon shift of 0, theoretically, but like maybe we're interested in the next 50 years. And so can we quantify what fire risk is and balance fire risk against carbon or emissions and things like that? I think this is a modeling framework that can start to get at that, but like some of the big shortcomings are that we aren't capturing type conversions. And so like, are there ways moving forward that we can better get changes in plant cover and can better maybe quantify other types of emissions besides carbon? Yeah. That's a loaded question. So yeah, I think I think there's useful ways of getting at that in the future. And I think that's a really interesting question. And we need to define what the time scale of the question is. And hopefully, like maybe through coupling different types of models, we can start to get at that.
A question from Dave Sopsis at Cal Fire. How are you estimating wind profiles for the WM spread model for fire spread associated with climate change slash warming?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so currently in WM Fire, it's a fairly simplistic representation of wind speed and wind direction that we get from our meteorological inputs. We are not representing weather patterns that are generated by fire. And so this is like a really important distinction between different types of models, because there are models out there that are going to do a lot better at getting these specific fire events. And so like what is happening with fire weather and where is that fire going to go? Those tactical models are really, really crucial. And this framework is not designed to capture that currently. But the sort of trade-off is that what we are attempting to do is get just general fire regime statistics and how climate is going to feed back and influence sort of fuel loading, fuel aridity, fire behavior, and then how that feeds back to influence future fires. And so I think it's like different models for different purposes, but currently it's fairly simplistic.
A question from Paulo. You showed increased nitrogen export following fires, especially following droughts. I was wondering whether the excess nitrogen exports are large enough to create major ecological disruptions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question in California because there's so much variability in rates of nitrogen deposition. And so, in the Santa Barbara system where I was running those simulations, it's a relatively pristine system where there's not huge amounts of N deposition, but you can still have big pulses of N to the stream. So that research was funded through the LTER, and they were interested in what the impacts were going to be on streams and kelp forest. And so I would say, like, yes, you can have these large pulses, but I would say that's probably especially true in these more nitrogen saturated systems where you have really high rates of N deposition, and you'll have not only this big pulse to the stream, but this pulse that is going to last for a longer period of time. And another thing with that is that those simulations were done at a patch scale rather than full watershed. And so what I wasn't accounting for there is whether or not that exported N would be taken up in a riparian area or elsewhere. So I think that's a key area for future research.
And I'll pop one last question in here because it comes from Janet Franklin. For those of you who are not ecologists, Janet's one of the big names in the field, of course, who asks, with regard to one of the we need to knows you mentioned, changes in plant community composition, are you working to couple these ecohydro and fire models to a forest disturbance and succession model such as Landis 2? Because that would be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that. And it's something I've danced around the idea with people, but I don't have specific plans just yet. I think there should be like a big workshop where we all talk about how to do this and and figure it out, because I think those type conversions are going to be really critical in how systems respond. We're seeing decreases in productivity, but if that creates a shift to shrubland, I mean, that's going to completely change the fire regime.
So we do have a few more questions, and we'll carry those over to the discussion. Again, the link for the post-webinar discussion is in the chat. So if you click on that, you'll leave this one and move over to the discussion if you can join us. But please do join me in thanking Dr. Erin Hanan for her fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Erin. And we hope you join us again next week for Dr. Kimiko Barrett of Headwaters Economics. And with that, we'll end the recording.